Welcome back, folks. So now we're going to talk about the physical aspects of brain development and how this relates to babies' behavior and how it also relates to experiences they have. So it won't be until next time that we talk about cognitive development, which does relate to the brain. But this time we're just digging into the more physical aspects and behavioral aspects of brain development. We'll dive into cognition next time and things like information processing and all of that. So our first stop is brain and behavior. What is the relationship between brain development and the onset of new skills and abilities? So what's going on in the brain? How is it developing and how does this reflect in infants and toddlers' behaviors? As a recap, the cerebral cortex, we talked about that and introduced it with its 4 lobes. And the cerebral cortex is immature at birth. Newborn behaviors are mostly reflexive, right? It's not until later that the cerebral cortex continues developing and allows for more voluntary behaviors and actions. It's also associated with abstract thought, problem solving, and language. Now enter the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of it. This plays a big role in the development of voluntary behavior. From 7 to 9 months, the prefrontal cortex develops in a way that allows infants to regulate themselves. If we think of examples of an infant or a toddler regulating their behavior, what do we think of? We might think of like this image here, cuddling a teddy bear when they're upset, or sucking their thumb, or stopping themselves from grabbing something enticing. They're actually starting to stop and think about their actions now, rather than mindlessly and even reflexively acting. So they can actually stop and think now. It's pretty immature at this point still, their regulation, but it is beginning. And of course, it's going to continue developing and getting more advanced as they grow older. Also a recap, myelination. So this is when a fatty substance covers axons and speeds the brain's communications, just as a recap. And there's a peak rate of myelination during the first year of life. So what's happening is it's forming neuron networks that are connecting different parts of the brain to work together. And this allows for things like problem solving, voluntary control of behavior, language acquisition, some pretty complex things. So there's a lot going on in the brain in that first year. And this reflects in babies' growing abilities and behaviors. What about the brain and experience? So we touched the surface on this last time, but let's look at to what extent does experience enhance or impede brain development and brain function? And we can even look at lack of experience to paint an even stronger picture sometimes, which is what we'll do here. To help answer this question, we're going to look at early life adversity and its profound impact on development. And early life adversity is a profound deprivation of some kind, which can have big consequences for long-term development. An example is the 1980s Romanian orphanages. So there were thousands of children in the 80s that were abandoned due to war and political violence, and therefore they were left in orphanages in Romania. So they received basic physical care, but little social or intellectual stimulation. So in other words, they received what they needed to survive and stay alive, but not necessarily to thrive and to just be a human, right? And involving those social and emotional and intellectual interactions. They were kept in cribs each day, like the image here, no social interaction really, nothing really stimulating to do or to look at. So imagine what this is like, just no sort of stimulation or emotional, social connections with others. So this is a prime example of deprivation of experience, no stimulation of the brain. And many of these children, unfortunately, had significant developmental delays as a result. However, those who were adopted in early infancy, particularly before 6 months old, these children were much less likely to suffer developmental impairments. So researchers discussed that, the brain undergoes significant development between 6 to 24 months. first 2 years in total, there's development going on. Particularly these 6 to 24 month period is seen as a sensitive period. This goes back to the idea of plasticity and sensitive periods. So during this time, these orphans lacked the experiences universal to our species, like being talked to, engaging in play and activities and stimulation. There was no stimulation, and it led to these adverse effects, especially for those who were not removed from this situation until later in infancy and toddlerhood, and even to childhood. Some of them were in the system for years. So it's a very sad reality, but I also want to say that humans are very resilient. The book highlights this young woman here who was one of these children in the Romanian orphanages. And she spent years in these neglectful conditions, but as an adult, ended up thriving and was even accepted into 5 universities, as our book highlights. So the past doesn't always dictate the future. It can make things much more challenging and completely unfair. No one should have to go through these types of situations. But I also want to point out that there is always room for resilience and the ability to eventually thrive. So that's where I'll end on that note for this portion. But in the next time, we're going to talk about motor development and gear into a different area of physical development. So that's where we're headed. Thanks for joining, everyone, and I will see you there.